Emma, I need you to send me $4,500 by Friday. My mother's voice on the phone carried that particular tone I'd learned to recognize over 28 years. The one that said this wasn't a request despite being phrased as one. The one that meant she'd already decided I would comply and was simply informing me of my obligation. I'd been sitting at my desk in our apartment, reviewing some financial reports for work, and I remember how my hand had frozen on the mouse, how my stomach had dropped in that familiar way it always did when I realized I was about to disappoint her simply by existing as myself, rather than the version of me she needed in that moment. Tyler's car broke down, she continued without waiting for my response, without asking if I had that kind of money or what my own financial situation looked like, without any preamble about how she knew this was a lot to ask. The transmission is shot, he needs it for work, and you know he's barely making ends meet as it is. I could hear the assumption in her voice, the certainty that I would say yes because I always said yes, because that's what I did in our family. I was the responsible one, the one who had it together, which really meant I was the one who got overlooked until someone needed something. The irony wasn't lost on me that being the middle child had somehow made me both invisible and indispensable, neither seen nor released. "Mom, that's a lot of money," I said carefully, already feeling the familiar guilt creeping in, the sense that I was being selfish for even hesitating. "I know, honey, but he's your brother. Family helps family." She said it so simply, as if it were a universal truth rather than a selective principle that seemed to apply only when I was the one being asked to help. I thought about 6 months ago, about Lauren's wedding, about how Mom had presented my older sister with an $80,000 check for a down payment on a house, had stood there beaming while Lauren cried happy tears and hugged her, had made a whole speech about setting up her baby girl for success and investing in her future. I thought about my own wedding 3 years earlier, about the gift card to Target for $200 that Mom had handed me in a regular greeting card, about how she'd said, "I hope this helps with setting up your household," as if $200 and $80,000 existed in the same universe of generosity. I thought about how I'd thanked her anyway, had hugged her and told her it was thoughtful, because that's what I did. I accepted what was given and pretended not to notice that what was given to me could barely buy a coffee maker, while what was given to Lauren could buy a life. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had been set so long ago that I couldn't remember a time when things were different, couldn't pinpoint the exact moment when the family hierarchy had crystallized into its permanent form, with Lauren at the top as the golden child, Tyler at the center as the baby who could do no wrong, and me somewhere in the margins as the responsible one, which I'd learned was just another way of saying the one who didn't require attention, or resources, or celebration. Lauren was 31 now, married to Derek for 4 years, mother to two perfect children, who Mom watched every Tuesday and Thursday without complaint, living in that house that Mom's down payment had made possible, working part-time as a dental hygienist while Derek managed a car dealership. She was the success story, the daughter who'd done everything right, gotten married at 27 in a wedding that cost $40,000, and that Mom had helped plan for 18 months, talking about it at every family gathering, showing everyone the Pinterest boards and the flower arrangements and the dress that cost $3,000. Tyler was 25, the surprise baby who'd arrived when I was 3 and Lauren was 6, and he'd been coddled from birth in a way that had calcified into a permanent state of extended adolescence, where nothing was ever quite his fault, and someone was always there to catch him when he fell. He'd gone to college on Mom and Dad's dime, partied his way through 5 years of a 4-year degree, graduated with a communications major that he'd never used, and now worked sporadically in restaurant jobs that he quit whenever a manager annoyed him or the schedule interfered with his social life. And then there was me, Emma, 28 years old, the one in the middle who'd learned early that the squeaky wheel got the grease and the quiet wheel got forgotten. I remembered being 11 years old at my middle school concert where I had a clarinet solo. Remembered scanning the audience for my parents' faces and not finding them. Remembered learning later that Tyler had a t-ball game at the same time, and of course they'd gone to that because he was only 5, and I was old enough to understand. I remembered my 16th birthday, falling on the same weekend as Lauren's college graduation. Remembered how we'd celebrated her accomplishment with a big dinner at the nicest restaurant in town, and how my birthday had been acknowledged with a grocery store cake and a card signed by everyone in identical handwriting that I suspected was Mom's. I remembered getting accepted to State University with a partial academic scholarship. Remembered telling Mom proudly that I'd only need to take out $15,000 in loans if I worked part-time. Remembered her saying, "That's good, honey," without looking up from the television where she was watching Tyler's soccer game on the DVR for the 3rd time. The accomplishments that should have mattered were treated as footnotes, expected outcomes from the daughter who had it together, while Lauren's mediocre grades were celebrated as victories, and Tyler's mere completion of basic tasks was treated as worthy of praise and usually financial reward. "Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, trying to find the words that would make her understand without starting a fight that I was too exhausted to have. "You just gave Lauren $80,000 6 months ago for her house." The silence on the other end lasted just long enough for me to hope that maybe this time would be different, that maybe she'd hear what I was actually saying. But then she sighed in that way that communicated I was being difficult, that I was making things harder than they needed to be, that I was somehow missing the obvious point that everyone else could see. "Emma, that's completely different. Lauren has children to think about. She needed a stable home for those babies. You know how expensive childcare is, how much it costs to raise kids these days. We were helping her build a future for our grandchildren." The justification came so smoothly, so reflexively, that I knew she'd never even questioned the disparity, had never once looked at the numbers side by side and seen how staggeringly different they were. How one daughter got a house, while another got a gift card that wouldn't even cover a decent set of sheets. "And Tyler is just starting out in life," she continued, not waiting for me to respond, building her case like a lawyer who'd already decided on the verdict. "He's only 25, he's still finding his way. He can't afford a major car repair right now, and he needs that car to get to work. You're doing fine, Emma. You and James both have good jobs. You don't need help like they do." There it was, the core assumption that had governed my entire relationship with my family, the belief that being stable meant being obligated, that not falling apart meant not deserving support, that managing my life successfully somehow disqualified me from being treated with the same generosity extended to my siblings who managed theirs poorly. "I'm also building a life, Mom," I said, and I could hear the slight tremor in my voice despite my best efforts to sound calm and reasonable. "James and I have plans, things we're saving for, goals we're working toward." She made a dismissive sound, something between a laugh and a scoff that communicated exactly how seriously she took my unnamed plans compared to Lauren's children and Tyler's immediate crisis. "You and James don't have kids yet," she said, and the word "yet" hung there like a question and an accusation and a dismissal all at once. "You can afford it. You're both working full-time. You don't have the expenses that Lauren has, or the struggles that Tyler is dealing with. This is what family does, Emma. We help each other when someone is in need." I sat there at my desk, looking at the financial reports on my screen, at the numbers and projections and analyses that made up my professional life, and I felt something crack inside my chest, some fragile thing that had been holding together for years, finally giving way under the weight of what she'd just said. The implication was so clear, so casually cruel, that it took my breath away. Because I didn't have children, my life mattered less. Because I was responsible, I didn't deserve help. Because I'd built stability through years of hard work and careful choices, I owed that stability to people who hadn't. I told Mom I needed to think about it, which was a diplomatic way of saying no, without actually saying the word, and ended the call before she could launch into another round of justifications that would make me feel smaller and more selfish with each carefully constructed argument. James got home from work an hour later to find me sitting at the kitchen table staring at nothing, and he knew immediately that something had happened because I usually greeted him at the door, usually had dinner started or at least planned, usually wasn't sitting in the growing darkness without even bothering to turn on a light. "Your mom called," he said. And it wasn't a question because he could read the specific kind of defeat on my face that only my family could create. The particular slump of my shoulders that came from being made to feel like I was failing some fundamental test of human decency. I told him everything, the whole conversation spilling out in a rush of words that sounded ridiculous even as I said them, because how could I explain to someone who came from a normal family, where love was distributed evenly, and support flowed both ways, that my mother thought it was perfectly reasonable to demand $4,500 from me for my brother's car, when she'd just given my sister $80,000 for a house? James listened without interrupting, his jaw getting tighter with each detail, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment before he said, "Emma, you know this is insane, right?" His voice was careful but firm, the tone he used when he was trying to help me see something I was too close to recognize. "You know that what she's asking isn't normal or fair or remotely okay." I felt tears prick my eyes because part of me did know that, but another part, the part that had been trained since childhood to accommodate and understand and put everyone else's needs before my own, that part was whispering that maybe I was being selfish. Maybe I should just pay it and keep the peace. James reached across the table and took my hands, and his were warm and solid and real in a way that made me feel anchored when everything else felt like it was shifting beneath me. "Let me remind you of some things," he said, and then he started listing them, point by point, incident by incident, the greatest hits of my family's failures that he'd witnessed in our 5 years together. They didn't contribute a single dollar to our wedding, while dropping 40,000 on Lauren's. They didn't call or visit or offer any help when I was laid off from my previous job and spent 3 months scrambling for freelance work to pay our rent. They didn't acknowledge my promotion to senior analyst 2 years ago, didn't ask about my work, didn't seem to register that I'd built a successful career in a competitive field. When James was laid off last year and we were living on my salary alone for 4 months, not once did my mother offer assistance or even ask if we were managing okay. But Tyler got his rent paid that same year when he decided to quit his job because his manager wasn't respectful enough. James had been keeping track in a way I hadn't, had been watching the pattern from the outside with clear eyes while I was buried too deep in the dysfunction to see it for what it was. "You need to set a boundary," he said, and his voice was gentle but absolutely certain. "You need to tell her no, and you need to stop letting them treat you like you're less important than your siblings." I knew he was right, could feel the truth of it in my bones, but I also felt the old familiar guilt rising up like a tide, the voice that said, "Good daughters, don't say no, that family means sacrifice," that I was being petty and small for keeping score. I was torn between self-preservation and the lifetime of programming that told me my job was to make things easier for everyone else, even when it made things harder for me. What I didn't tell James that night, what I hadn't told anyone in my family because they'd never asked, and I'd long since stopped volunteering information about my life that they wouldn't care about anyway, was that I had the money. Not just enough to cover Tyler's car repair, but significantly more than that. More than my mother probably imagined I'd ever have, certainly more than she'd ever asked about or shown interest in. 3 weeks earlier, I'd sat in a conference room on the 14th floor of Tech Vista Solutions with my boss Angela and the VP of Finance, while they offered me a promotion that would change everything about my financial future. Director of Finance. The title itself felt surreal, like something that belonged to someone else. Someone more important than the middle child who'd learned to stay quiet and not take up space. I'd been a senior financial analyst for 2 years, had worked at Tech Vista for 5, had built a reputation for being meticulous and strategic, and the person who could find inefficiencies that others missed. And now they were offering me $185,000 a year, more than double my previous salary of $92,000, plus a $50,000 signing bonus that would hit my account within 30 days, plus stock options that the VP estimated would be worth approximately $200,000 when they vested over the next 4 years. I'd sat there trying to keep my face professionally composed while my heart pounded and my mind raced through all the possibilities that kind of money represented, all the dreams that James and I had put on hold or told ourselves would happen someday, all the stability and security and choices that had suddenly become real and tangible and within reach. I'd accepted on the spot, shaken their hands, and walked back to my desk feeling like I was floating 6 inches off the ground, and the first person I'd called was James, who'd actually screamed with joy so loud that I'd had to hold the phone away from my ear. But I didn't call my mother, didn't text my father, didn't mention it to Lauren or Tyler. Because somewhere deep in the learned silence of being the overlooked daughter, I knew they wouldn't react the way James had, wouldn't understand the significance of what I'd accomplished, wouldn't celebrate with the genuine joy that this achievement deserved. My family had never asked about my work, never inquired about my career trajectory, never seemed to register that I was building something meaningful in a competitive field that required skill and dedication and intelligence. When I'd gotten my master's degree in finance 4 years ago, attending night classes while working full-time, my mother's only comment had been that it seemed like a lot of work for a piece of paper. When I'd made senior analyst, no one had acknowledged it. My professional life existed in a realm that my family never entered, never explored, never thought to ask about. And I'd learned to keep it separate from them, to not expect recognition that would never come. So I'd kept the promotion quiet, had told James and a few close friends and my colleagues who understood what it meant, and I'd started planning for the things we'd been dreaming about for years. A house with enough space to grow into, with a yard and good schools nearby and room for the family we desperately wanted. And the IVF treatments that we'd been told we'd need after 2 years of trying naturally had produced nothing but heartbreak and negative pregnancy tests. The money my mother wanted for Tyler's car, that $4,500 that she thought I should hand over without question, was already allocated in my mind to the life James and I were building together, to the future we'd earned through hard work and sacrifice, and all the years of managing our finances carefully while my siblings got bailouts and handouts and houses. My mother didn't accept my silence as an answer, which I should have expected because she'd never been good at accepting anything that didn't align with what she wanted, and the next morning my phone started ringing at 7:30. Early enough that I was still in bed, but late enough that she could claim she was being considerate of my schedule that she'd never actually asked about or tried to understand. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 9, at 11, at 1 in the afternoon, each time leaving messages that started out reasonable and concerned, but grew progressively more frustrated as the day wore on. Her voice taking on that particular edge that used to make me scramble to fix whatever I'd done wrong, to smooth over whatever conflict my existence had created. Emma, I really need you to call me back. We need to discuss Tyler's situation, the first message said. Emma, I don't understand why you're avoiding this. It's not like I'm asking for something unreasonable, the second one went. Emma, your brother is really struggling and I thought you'd care about that, but I guess I was wrong, the third one concluded. And that last part was designed to hit exactly where it always hit, right in the center of the guilt that had been carefully cultivated in me since childhood. The text messages started that afternoon, a steady stream of them that made my phone buzz every 20 minutes like some kind of Chinese water torture designed to wear down my resistance through sheer persistence. Tyler really needs this help. I'm disappointed in your attitude. Family is supposed to be there for each other. I didn't raise you to be selfish. Each message was a tiny dart aimed at the part of me that still desperately wanted her approval, that still believed maybe if I just did enough, gave enough, sacrificed enough, she would finally see me the way she saw Lauren and Tyler. Then Lauren got involved. Because of course she did. Because Mom had clearly called in reinforcements when I didn't immediately crumble under the initial pressure. My sister sent a text that was somehow even more effective than Mom's, because it came wrapped in the language of disappointment rather than anger, the quiet devastation of someone who'd expected better from me and been let down. "I can't believe you're being like this," Lauren wrote. "Tyler is family. Mom helped me because I needed it, and now Tyler needs it, and you're just saying no? That's really selfish, Emma. I thought you were better than that." The word selfish landed like a punch, sharp and breathtaking, because it reframed everything I'd been feeling, turned my attempt at self-preservation into a character flaw, made my boundary into evidence of moral failing. Tyler's texts were different, more passive-aggressive, the wounded little brother routine he'd perfected over 25 years of being coddled and protected from consequences. "Guess I know where I stand with you," he wrote. "Thought family meant something, but I guess not." And then, an hour later, "Mom's really upset. Hope you're happy." Each message was designed to paint me as the villain in a story where I'd done nothing except refuse to hand over money I'd earned to fix problems I hadn't created. But the narrative they were building was so consistent and came from so many directions that I started to feel the old doubt creeping in. The whisper that maybe they were right. Maybe I was selfish. Maybe something really was wrong with me, that I couldn't just be generous and help without resentment. My father called on day 3 of the campaign, and that's when I knew Mom had pulled out every weapon in her arsenal, because Dad never got involved in family drama, never took sides, never did anything except sit silently in his chair and let Mom orchestrate everything while he nodded along. "Emma," he said, and his voice was tired in the way it always was when Mom had given him an assignment he didn't want to complete. "I think you should just help your brother out. It's not worth all this conflict. You know how your mother gets. Just keep the peace." Keep the peace. That had been his advice my entire life, the solution to every conflict, the answer to every complaint. Don't make waves, don't cause problems, don't upset your mother. Just keep the peace, even if keeping it meant swallowing your own feelings and needs and sense of fairness until you choked on them. I sat on my couch with my phone in my hand, feeling my anxiety build like pressure behind my eyes, the physical manifestation of years of this same dynamic playing out over and over, and I could feel myself starting to break under the weight of it, starting to think that maybe it would just be easier to pay the money and make everyone happy and go back to being invisible and undemanding. James found me like that, staring at the screen full of messages, and he sat down next to me and took the phone gently from my hands. He read through the texts, his expression growing darker with each one, and then he looked at me with such fierce certainty that I felt something steady in the chaos. "You're not selfish," he said. "You're not wrong. And you're not giving in to this." The text arrived on a Thursday afternoon while I was in a budget review meeting, my phone buzzing against the conference table with enough persistence that I had to glance at it to make sure it wasn't an emergency. And when I saw it was from my mother, I felt that familiar combination of dread and obligation that her name on my screen always triggered. "Family dinner Sunday at 2 p.m. for Dad's birthday," the message read, followed immediately by another. "Everyone will be there. No excuses." I stared at those words during a presentation about Q3 projections and felt something uneasy settle in my stomach. An instinct that this wasn't really about Dad's birthday at all, but rather another vector in the ongoing campaign to wear me down about Tyler's car. But I also knew that if I refused to come, I'd be painted as the daughter who couldn't even show up for her own father's birthday, the ultimate proof of my selfishness that Mom could deploy in every future guilt trip. When I got home that evening and told James about the dinner, he looked at me with immediate suspicion and said exactly what I'd been thinking. "It's a trap," he said flatly. "She's going to ambush you in front of everyone and use the audience to pressure you into giving in." I knew he was right, could feel the truth of it in the way the invitation had been phrased as a command rather than a request, in the emphasis on everyone being there, in the timing of it coming right in the middle of the pressure campaign when I still hadn't responded to any of Mom's demands about the money. James argued that I should skip it, send Dad a card and a gift, and tell Mom I had other plans, establish the boundary now before walking into whatever she had planned. But I couldn't quite bring myself to do that, because underneath all the resentment and hurt, there was still that deep-rooted programming that said you show up for family birthdays, you don't miss important events, you don't give them legitimate reasons to call you selfish. So I agreed to go, against James's advice and against my own better judgment. And he insisted on coming with me, even though Mom's text had clearly been addressed only to me. And I was grateful for that, because I knew I'd need him there as a witness to my sanity and a reminder that someone in my life saw me clearly. When we pulled up to my parents' house on Sunday afternoon, the street was lined with cars that I recognized. My aunt's sedan and my uncle's truck and my cousin's SUV, far more vehicles than should have been there for a simple family birthday lunch. And I felt my chest tighten with the confirmation that James had been exactly right. This wasn't a birthday celebration. This was a tribunal. And I was walking directly into it with my eyes open because some self-destructive part of me still believed I owed them my presence, still thought maybe I could make them understand if I just explained it the right way. We walked up to the front door, with James's hand solid and steady against my lower back, and I rang the doorbell with a hand that trembled slightly because I knew that whatever happened in the next few hours was going to change everything, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it, even though I knew it was inevitable. The house smelled like my childhood, that particular combination of my mother's pot roast and the vanilla candles she bought in bulk from the discount store, and the living room was packed with relatives who all turned to look when James and I walked in, their faces arranging themselves into expressions of greeting that didn't quite reach their eyes. Dinner itself was a careful performance where I pushed food around my plate and participated in conversations about my cousin's new job and my aunt's upcoming cruise and my uncle's thoughts on the weather, all of it surface level and polite, while I felt the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the room like gathering storm clouds. Mom was too attentive, too quick to refill drinks and offer seconds, playing the role of gracious hostess with an edge of tension that told me she was waiting for something, building toward something, and I caught her exchanging looks with Lauren across the table that confirmed what I already knew about why we were really all there. After the cake had been served and Dad had opened his presents with his usual understated appreciation, after the plates had been cleared and everyone had moved back into the living room with coffee and the comfortable settling that comes after a meal, my mother stood up near the fireplace with a casual deliberateness that made my stomach drop because I recognized the staging of it, the way she'd positioned herself at the center of attention. "I'm so glad everyone could be here today," she said, and her voice carried that particular tone of someone about to say something important, something that required an audience. Family is so important, being there for each other, supporting each other through difficult times. She looked directly at me then, and I felt James's hand find mine and squeeze, and I knew it was starting, knew that whatever I'd walked into was about to spring closed around me. "Tyler is going through a really hard time right now," Mom continued, and I saw my brother look down at his hands with practiced vulnerability, the wounded expression he'd perfected over years of being rescued from his own consequences. "His car needs major repairs, $4,500, and he just doesn't have that kind of money. I've been trying to help him figure out a solution, and I asked Emma if she could help out since she and James are doing well for themselves." The way she said it made "doing well" sound like an accusation, like our financial stability was something vaguely shameful or suspicious, and I felt every eye in the room shift to me, measuring, judging, waiting for my response to this public calling out. "But Emma said no," Mom continued, and there was a tremor in her voice that was pure theater, the hurt mother whose daughter had disappointed her. "She won't help her own brother, even though he really needs it, even though family is supposed to be there for each other." Lauren leaned forward from her position on the couch, bouncing her youngest on her knee, and added her voice to the narrative that was being constructed around me. "At least when Mom helped me with the house down payment, I was grateful," she said, and her tone was pointed, deliberately drawing the comparison. At least I understand what family means, what we're supposed to do for each other. I didn't just think about myself. Tyler looked up then, and his eyes were slightly red in a way that might have been genuine emotion, or might have been the result of rubbing them in the bathroom before coming back out, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and hurt. "I just thought she'd care enough to help," he said. "I guess I was wrong about that." I sat there on the armchair with James beside me and felt 20 pairs of eyes on my face, watching for my reaction, and I could feel the judgment rolling off them in waves. The collective disappointment of people who had been told a story in which I was the villain, and who had no reason to question that narrative because it was coming from my own mother. My Aunt Carol was the first to speak into the silence that followed Tyler's performance, and her voice carried that particular tone of someone who'd already made up their mind about a situation based entirely on someone else's characterization of it. "Emma, honey, I have to say I'm a little surprised at you," she said, shaking her head with what looked like genuine disappointment. "You always were a bit self-centered, even as a kid, always off doing your own thing instead of being part of the family, but I thought you'd have grown out of that by now." The words hit me like a slap, because they weren't true. They had never been true. And the fact that she believed them meant my mother had been telling the story about me for years, shaping the narrative of who I was to everyone in our extended family in ways I'd never known about. Uncle Mike cleared his throat and leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, looking at me with the expression of someone about to impart important wisdom. "Family is supposed to support each other," he said, and his tone was patient, like he was explaining something simple to someone slow to understand. "That's what we do. That's what family means. When someone needs help, you help them. You don't ask questions. You don't keep score. You just show up." My cousin Jenny, who I'd barely spoken to in 5 years, nodded enthusiastically and jumped in with her own contribution to my public trial. "I helped both my brothers when they needed money," she said, and there was a note of self-righteousness in her voice that made my jaw clench. "I didn't have much, but I gave what I could because that's what you do. Maybe if you spent less on whatever you spend on, you'd have money to help your own brother." Mom was watching all of this with an expression that looked like vindication, like she'd known that once everyone heard the facts they'd agree with her assessment of my character, and she added her voice to the chorus of condemnation. "I just don't understand where I went wrong with you, Emma," she said, and her voice broke slightly on my name. "I raised you to care about family, to understand that we take care of our own, but somewhere along the way, you decided that your money was more important than your brother's well-being, that keeping your comfort was more important than helping someone you're supposed to love." Not one person asked me why I'd said no. Not one person questioned whether there might be context they were missing. Not one person mentioned the $80,000 that had gone to Lauren or pointed out that maybe, just maybe, the expectations placed on me were different from the expectations placed on my siblings. They had been given a story in which I was selfish and cruel, and they had accepted it without question, because it came from my mother, and because it was easier to pile on than to stand apart. I sat there with my face burning and my hands clenched together so tightly that my nails bit into my palms, and I felt the full weight of my humiliation settle over me like a heavy blanket, suffocating and inescapable, while James's hand on my knee was the only thing anchoring me to the reality that this assessment of my character was wrong, that I wasn't the person they were describing, even if in that moment I couldn't quite remember how to defend myself against the collective judgment of everyone I'd known since childhood. Lauren stood up then with her daughter still balanced on her hip, and she crossed the room to stand next to Mom by the fireplace, a united front of righteous family values arrayed against my apparent selfishness, and when she spoke her voice carried that particular combination of disappointment and superiority that she'd perfected over the years of being the golden child. "Honestly, Emma, when are you going to grow up and contribute to this family?" she said, and there was genuine bewilderment in her tone, like she truly could not understand why I was being so difficult about something so simple. "We all help each other. We all pitch in when someone needs something, but you just take and never give back. She started listing examples then, and each one landed like a stone thrown at my chest because they were either completely fabricated or so twisted from reality that they'd become unrecognizable. She talked about how I'd borrowed mom's car for 6 months after college and never paid for gas, which had actually been 2 weeks, and I'd filled the tank every time. She mentioned that they'd paid for my textbooks my senior year of college, which had never happened because I'd been on scholarship and worked at the campus bookstore for my books. She brought up how I'd stayed at their house for free when James and I were between apartments, conveniently forgetting that we'd stayed for 1 week and had bought them $1,000 gift card to their favorite restaurant as a thank you, and that during that same period, I'd watched her kids for free 3 times a week for 2 months when her regular babysitter quit. Every example was like that, either invented whole cloth or distorted beyond recognition, and as I listened to her recite this catalog of my supposed transgressions, I realized something that made my chest feel simultaneously tight and strangely loose. They genuinely believed this narrative. This wasn't a calculated attack where they knew they were lying. They had, over the course of years, constructed a story about who I was that fit their need to see themselves as generous and me as selfish. And they had told that story so many times that it had become truth in their minds, solid and unquestionable and real. My invisibility, my years of being overlooked and forgotten and dismissed, had somehow transformed in their memories into me being distant and withholding. My independence, born from necessity because no help was ever offered, had become evidence of my failure to appreciate family. My quiet acceptance of unequal treatment had been interpreted as me not needing anything, not wanting anything, not deserving anything, and that perception had calcified into the belief that I had always been the taker, the selfish one, the child who never gave back. Something broke inside me then, not loudly or dramatically, but with a quiet finality like ice cracking on a winter lake, and I felt the people-pleasing instinct that had ruled my life for 28 years simply die, just stop functioning like a machine that had finally worn out its last working part. I had spent my entire life trying to be good enough, trying to be worth noticing, trying to earn the love and attention that was given freely to my siblings, and in that moment, I understood with perfect clarity that nothing I did would ever be enough, because they needed me to be the problem, they needed me to be the selfish one, because if I wasn't, then they would have to examine their own behavior, and that was something they were fundamentally unwilling to do. I spoke for the first time since the ambush had begun, and my voice came out quieter than I'd intended, but steadier than I'd expected, cutting through the murmur of continued judgment like a knife through fabric. "When have I taken from this family?" I asked, and the room fell silent in that abrupt way that happens when people realize the person they've been talking about is about to talk back. I looked around at all of them, these people who had spent the last 30 minutes cataloging my failures and selfishness, and I asked again, seriously, I want to know. When have I taken from this family? What specifically did I take? Nobody answered, and the silence stretched out for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. And I watched them glance at each other with the uncertainty of people who'd been very sure of their position until someone asked them to defend it with specifics. I turned to my mother, looked directly at her, and asked, "What did you give me for my wedding?" She blinked at me like the question was unfair somehow, like I was changing the rules by bringing up concrete facts, and she said, "We gave you $200, which quite frankly, you barely thanked us for." I nodded slowly and asked, "And what did you give Lauren for hers?" Mom's face flushed and her mouth tightened, and she said, "That's different, Emma. Lauren has children to think about. She needed help getting started." I felt something like calm settle over me, the calm that comes when you finally stopped being afraid of the consequences of telling the truth. And I said, "She wasn't pregnant at her wedding. Neither of her children had been born yet. She got $80,000 for a house down payment when she had exactly the same number of children I did, which was zero. I turned to Tyler and asked, "When I loaned you $1,500 3 years ago for your security deposit, did I ever ask you to pay it back?" He looked uncomfortable and muttered something about meaning to get to it, and I said, "That wasn't the question. Did I ask you for it back?" He shook his head. I looked at Uncle Mike and asked, "Did you know that I paid $800 for Mom's car repair 2 years ago when her transmission went out?" His expression shifted slightly toward uncertainty, and he said he hadn't known that. I asked Aunt Carol, "Did you know that I've bought all the Christmas gifts for Mom and Dad for the last 5 years, spending about $500 each year because nobody else was doing it and I didn't want them to have nothing under the tree?" She looked at Mom, who was suddenly very interested in the pattern on her napkin. I was just asking questions, just laying out facts, but I could feel the energy in the room shifting as people began to realize that maybe the story they'd been told wasn't quite complete, that maybe there was information they hadn't been given, and the power of my calm tone was somehow more devastating than if I'd yelled or cried, because there was nothing for them to dismiss as emotional or irrational, just question after question that nobody seemed able to answer in a way that supported the narrative they'd all so confidently believed just minutes before. I pulled my phone out of my purse then, and the simple action of reaching for it and unlocking the screen felt like suiting up for battle, arming myself with the only weapons I'd ever really trusted, which were facts and numbers and documentation, the irrefutable evidence that couldn't be twisted or reinterpreted or conveniently forgotten the way memories could be. "Let me give you some specifics," I said, and I opened my notes app where I'd been keeping track for years without really knowing why. Maybe some part of me had always known this day would come when I'd need to defend myself with something more solid than my own recollection of events. March 15th, 3 years ago, I loaned Tyler $1,500 for his security deposit on the apartment on Madison Street, the one with the broken dishwasher that he complained about for 6 months. And that money was never repaid, despite him promising it would be just a short-term loan until his next paycheck. I looked up from my phone to see Tyler's face had gone red, and he was staring at the floor. June 8th, 2 years ago, I paid $800 for Mom's transmission repair because hers had gone out and she didn't have the money, and Dad's insurance settlement hadn't come through yet from his minor accident, and I took money out of my savings account that I'd been building up to replace our couch. Mom opened her mouth to say something, but I kept going, my voice still calm and level like I was presenting a financial report to the board of directors at work, which in a way I suppose I was. December 23rd through December 25th for the past 5 years. I have purchased all Christmas gifts for Mom and Dad because nobody else was doing it, and I didn't want them to wake up on Christmas morning with nothing to open, and those gifts have averaged $500 per year, including the leather recliner Dad wanted 2 years ago that cost $700 alone, which means I've spent approximately $2,500 on gifts that were from all of us, but paid for entirely by me. Aunt Carol's expression had shifted from judgmental to something that looked almost like guilt, and I could see her doing the math in her head, adding up these numbers that nobody had bothered to track before because it had been easier to believe I never contributed anything. And then there was the family vacation to the lake house last summer, July 10th through July 17th, when Mom wanted all of us together for 1 week and found that rental property that was $2,000 for the week, and everyone agreed we'd all chip in to cover it, but somehow, when it came time to actually pay the deposit, I was the only one who had my portion ready, so I paid the entire $2,000 with the understanding that everyone would pay me back their share, and I'm still waiting for that reimbursement 11 months later. I watched James in my peripheral vision and saw him nodding slightly because he'd been there for all of this, had witnessed these transactions, and watched me make excuse after excuse for why it was okay that I was always the one giving and never receiving. And I saw several of my relatives shifting uncomfortably in their seats because the narrative they'd been fed was crumbling under the weight of documented facts with specific dates and dollar amounts that couldn't be dismissed as my perception, or my sensitivity, or my selfishness. I scrolled further back in my notes then, to the section I'd labeled Family Financial Summary, because that's what happens when you're a financial analyst who's spent years watching resources flow past you to everyone else. You start documenting it with the same clinical precision you'd use for a corporate audit. And I said, let me put this in perspective for everyone, since we're all so concerned about fairness and family obligation. I looked directly at Lauren and said, over the past 5 years, Mom and Dad have given you approximately $125,000. And I can break that down if you'd like, starting with the $80,000 down payment on your house 6 months ago, the $15,000 they contributed to your wedding that they called a gift, but that everyone knows was actually them paying for half of it. The $12,000 they gave you over 2 years to help with childcare costs when you said daycare was too expensive, the $8,000 car they bought you when your Honda broke down, the $6,000 worth of furniture they purchased for your first apartment, including that bedroom set you just had to have from Pottery Barn, and the various loans and cash gifts that totaled another $4,000 for things like your emergency root canal, and that time your husband was between jobs for 3 months. Lauren's face had gone from smug to pale, and she opened her mouth to protest, but I turned to Tyler before she could speak and continued. Tyler has received approximately $45,000 in the same 5-year period, including the $32,000 Mom and Dad paid for his last 2 years of college after he lost his scholarship due to his grades, the $4,000 they've paid toward his car insurance over the years when he claimed he couldn't afford it, the $3,000 they gave him for his security deposits on various apartments, the $2,500 they paid for his lawyer fees when he got that DUI 2 years ago, and the various cash infusions that total another $3,500 for things like credit card debt and that time he needed to pay back his friend Marcus for some unspecified loan. I paused and let those numbers hang in the air for a moment, watching my family absorb the reality of the disparity that had always existed but never been quantified quite so precisely. And then I said, the total amount Mom and Dad have given me in that same 5-year period is $850, which includes the $200 for my wedding, the $400 they gave me for my 30th birthday last year after Dad said they felt bad they hadn't done more, and the $250 they gave me 2 Christmases ago when they said they wanted to help with our heating bill during that particularly cold winter, which I actually didn't need, but accepted because I thought maybe it meant they were finally seeing me as someone worth helping. My voice was still calm and level, still clinical, still just presenting facts the way I'd present a quarterly financial report. But I could feel the weight of those numbers settling over the room like a heavy blanket, suffocating the narrative that had been built around my selfishness. And I watched as various relatives did the math in their heads and realized that the disparity wasn't just significant, but actually staggering. That $170,000 had been distributed between 2 siblings, while less than $1,000 had gone to the third, and no amount of justification about children or circumstances could explain away that kind of difference, because the numbers didn't lie even when the people presenting them wanted to. Lauren's voice cut through the silence then, with that sharp edge she always got when she felt defensive, and she said, this isn't about money, Emma. It's about caring about your family, about being there for the people who raised you. And I felt something shift inside me because she was right in a way she didn't intend. It wasn't about money at all. It was about something much deeper and more painful than dollars and cents could ever quantify. You're absolutely right, I said, turning to face her directly across Mom's dining room table. So let me ask you something, Lauren. Since we're talking about caring and being there for family, who came to my college graduation? The question hung in the air, and I watched her face go blank because she genuinely didn't remember. And the answer was nobody. Not a single member of my immediate family had made the 3-hour drive to watch me walk across that stage and receive my bachelor's degree that I'd earned while working 25 hours a week at the campus library and another 15 hours weekend shifts at the restaurant on Main Street. Who came to my master's degree ceremony 2 years later? I continued. And again silence. Because again the answer was nobody. Mom had said they couldn't make it because Tyler had a baseball tournament that weekend that turned out to be just a regular season game that wasn't even playoffs. And Dad had said the drive was too far, and his back had been bothering him, and Lauren had been busy with her kids, and I'd sat in that auditorium with James and his parents who'd driven 6 hours to be there for me, even though I was just their son's girlfriend at the time. Do you remember Dad's speech at my wedding reception? I asked, looking at my father now, watching him shift uncomfortably in his chair at the head of the table, and I didn't wait for an answer before I said, "It was 2 minutes and 17 seconds long, I know because James's cousin timed it, and most of it was about how Dad met Mom and their early years of marriage, with about 30 seconds at the end, wishing James and me well." I turned back to Lauren and said, "Your wedding, Lauren." Dad spoke for 15 minutes. He cried twice. He talked about watching you grow up and how proud he was of the woman you'd become. He told stories about teaching you to ride a bike and helping you with your homework and walking you down the aisle being the greatest honor of his life. And I sat at my table watching that and wondering why he'd had nothing to say about me at my own wedding 8 months earlier. I could see Mom's eyes filling with tears, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of discomfort at having these truths exposed in front of her sisters and brothers and their children, and I pressed on because I was done protecting everyone's comfort at the expense of my own dignity. "Tell me, anyone in this room, where do I work?" I asked, looking around at blank faces, and I said, "Anyone? Mom? Dad? Lauren, you and I talk at least twice a month. Where does your sister work?" She opened her mouth and closed it again and finally said, "Some financial company, I think?" And I nodded slowly because that was as much as any of them had ever bothered to know about the career I'd built over the past 6 years, the accomplishments I'd earned, the professional life that had consumed thousands of hours of my time and energy and ambition. "I work at Cortex Solutions," I said, my voice cutting through the uncomfortable silence that had settled over the room, and I watched as a few relatives nodded like they'd heard of it, which they probably had since it was one of the largest tech companies in the state with offices in 3 cities and a reputation for innovation that had put it in the business news regularly over the past 5 years. "I'm a senior financial analyst there. Or I was until 6 weeks ago," I continued. And I saw Mom's face brighten slightly, like she thought maybe I was about to tell them I'd been fired and actually did need help, which would have fit so nicely into her narrative about me being the one who always needed rescuing, even though I never asked for it. "6 weeks ago, I was promoted to Director of Finance," I said, and I watched the words land without much impact because none of them really understood what that meant, what kind of achievement it represented in a company of over 2,000 employees, how many people I'd competed against for that position, how many 60-hour weeks I'd worked to prove I deserved it. Mom's response confirmed exactly what I'd expected. "That's nice, honey," she said with that vague, supportive tone she used when she had no idea what I was talking about, but felt obligated to say something positive. And I saw Lauren glance at her husband with an expression that said she thought I was making a bigger deal out of this than it warranted. "The position comes with a salary of $185,000 per year," I said. And that's when the room went completely silent. The kind of silence where you can hear the grandfather clock ticking in the hallway and someone's breath catching in their throat, because that number meant something to everyone in a way that job titles didn't. I watched Dad's eyes widen because he knew exactly what that meant. He'd worked for 37 years as a manufacturing supervisor and had retired 3 years ago making $65,000 annually, which had been a good, solid middle-class income that had raised 3 children and paid for a modest house and 2 cars and family vacations to the beach every other summer. I was making almost 3 times what he'd made at the peak of his career, and I'd just turned 32 years old. "That's more than Brad makes," Lauren said quietly, referring to her husband who worked as an operations manager at a distribution center and made somewhere around $70,000. And I could hear in her voice that she was recalculating everything she'd assumed about my life, about my financial situation, about my ability to help Tyler with his car. The promotion also came with a $50,000 signing bonus, I continued, because I was done minimizing my achievements to make other people comfortable, done pretending to be less successful than I was so that my siblings wouldn't feel bad about themselves, and I said, and stock options that are currently valued at approximately $200,000, which will vest over the next 4 years, but which represent real significant wealth if the company continues to perform the way it has been. I let those numbers sink in for a moment, watching as various relatives did the math in their heads, calculating that I was talking about $435,000 in total compensation over the next few years, not counting any additional bonuses or stock appreciation. And I saw the exact moment when Uncle Mike realized what I was really saying. I'd had the money all along, every penny that Mom had asked me to give to Tyler for his car. I'd had it sitting in my bank account earning interest, and I'd chosen not to give it to him, made a conscious, deliberate decision that this family was now interpreting as proof of my selfishness rather than what it actually was, which was the first boundary I'd ever successfully set against their endless demands. Uncle Mike was the one who broke the stunned silence, his voice carrying that edge of confusion mixed with anger that comes when someone's worldview gets suddenly challenged, and he said, "Then if you have all that money, why the hell didn't you help your brother with his car?" And I turned to look at him directly. This man who'd been judging me 30 minutes earlier without knowing a single fact about my life. And I said with perfect clarity, "Because I don't owe him anything." I watched those words hit the room like a physical force, and I continued before anyone could interrupt. I started working when I was 14 years old, babysitting for neighbors and cleaning houses on weekends, and by 16 I was working 20 hours a week at the grocery store while maintaining a 4.0 GPA because I knew that scholarships were my only path to college since Mom and Dad made it very clear there wasn't going to be money for me the way there was for Lauren. I looked at my parents and saw Dad's face redden because he knew it was true. They'd paid for Lauren's entire 4 years at State University, room and board included, while I'd gotten a partial academic scholarship and covered the rest with 3 jobs simultaneously: the campus library during the day, the restaurant on weekends, and tutoring other students whenever I could fit it in. I put myself through my bachelor's degree and then my master's degree, living in a studio apartment that cost $400 a month because it was in the worst part of town and I could barely afford that, eating ramen noodles and pasta 4 nights a week, wearing the same 3 professional outfits to my internship because I couldn't afford more. And I did all of that without asking this family for a single dollar because I knew there was no point in asking. I turned to Tyler, who was staring at his plate, and I said, "While I was working those 3 jobs and going to school full-time, Tyler, you were at college partying 4 nights a week, failing 2 classes your freshman year, switching your major 3 times, and taking 5.5 years to graduate with a degree you've never used, and Mom and Dad paid for every semester, every textbook, every meal plan, even sent you spending money." I watched him open his mouth to argue and then close it again because every word was documented truth. I paid for my own car when I was 19, a 12-year-old Honda Civic that cost me $3,000 that I'd saved for 8 months to afford, and I drove that car for 9 years until I could afford to replace it, while Tyler got handed Dad's old truck for free when Dad upgraded. I looked at Lauren and said, "I paid for my own apartment deposit, my own furniture, my own wedding. Because you remember that $200 gift card Mom mentioned? That was literally the only financial contribution my parents made to my wedding, while Lauren got $80,000 toward a house, and before that had Mom and Dad paying her rent for 6 months when she was between jobs." I felt my voice strengthening with every word, felt years of suppressed truth finally being spoken into existence, and I said, "So when you ask me why I didn't give Tyler money for his car, the answer is simple. I earned every dollar I have through my own work, my own sacrifice, my own choices, and I get to decide what I do with it. And I have decided that I will never again subsidize the inequality that this family has practiced for my entire life. And since you all seem so concerned about where my money is going and why I'm not giving it to Tyler, I said, feeling something settle into place inside me. A calm certainty that came from finally speaking truth after years of silence. Let me tell you exactly what James and I are doing with our financial resources. I looked around the room at all these faces that had judged me without knowing anything about my life, and I said, 2 weeks from today, on the 15th of next month, James and I are closing on a house, our dream house that we've been saving for and planning for since the year we got married. I watched Mom's expression shift to surprise because she'd never asked about our housing situation, never inquired whether we were thinking about buying, never offered the kind of support she'd given Lauren when she was house hunting. It's a 4-bedroom colonial in Westbridge, I continued, naming the suburb that everyone knew was one of the nicest areas within 30 miles, where the schools were rated excellent and the property values had been climbing steadily for a decade. With a pool and a 2-acre lot and a finished basement, and we're paying $650,000 for it. I heard someone gasp, probably Aunt Carol, because that was more than most people in this room would earn in 10 years. And I saw Lauren's face go pale because she'd been so proud of her little starter home that Mom's $80,000 had helped her buy, the one that was worth maybe $220,000 in the current market. We've put down $130,000, I said, which represents years of saving and investing, years of living below our means and making careful financial decisions, and our mortgage payment will be around $3,000 a month, which is manageable on my current salary. I let them absorb that. The reality that I was living in a completely different financial universe than they'd imagined, and then I delivered the other piece of information that I knew would reshape how they saw me forever. And next month, James and I are starting IVF treatments, I said, my voice softening slightly, because this was the vulnerable part. The admission that something in my life hadn't gone according to plan. Because we've been trying to have a baby for 3 years now without success, and after multiple consultations with fertility specialists and numerous tests, we've determined that IVF is our best option for conceiving. I saw Mom's hand go to her mouth, and for a moment I thought maybe she was feeling remorse for all the years she'd dismissed my childless state as a choice rather than a struggle. But I pushed forward. The IVF treatments will cost approximately $30,000 for the initial round, possibly more if we need multiple attempts, and insurance covers almost none of it. So that's another major expense we've planned and saved for. I looked directly at Mom and said, "So when you called me 3 weeks ago asking for $4,500 for Tyler's car, that money wasn't just sitting around waiting for a purpose. It was already allocated, already committed to building the life that James and I want, the family that we're trying to create." I paused and then said what I really needed them to understand. The family I'm building will be different from the one I grew up in, I can promise you that. Because my children will never wonder if they matter less than their siblings, will never have to earn love through achievement or watch resources flow to everyone but them, will never sit at a table like this one wondering why they're not enough. I felt tears threatening, but I kept my voice steady, and I said, "That's what your $4,500 represents. Not a car repair, but a choice. My choice to invest in my own future instead of perpetually subsidizing the inequality that this family has normalized for my entire life." The silence that followed my words was different from the earlier silences, heavier somehow, weighted with the realization that the narrative they'd all constructed about me had just been shattered beyond repair, and I watched as that realization moved across different faces in different ways. Mom started crying, but I could see immediately that these weren't tears of remorse or regret for how she'd treated me all these years. These were tears of embarrassment, the humiliation of having her parenting laid bare in front of her sisters and brothers, an extended family, of having everyone in this room now understand that she'd given one daughter $80,000 and another daughter $200,000, And I felt nothing watching her cry, because I'd cried so many times over the years when no one comforted me. Lauren's face had gone from pale to flushed, a deep red creeping up her neck, and her expression was pure fury, not the shame or guilt I might have hoped for, but actual anger, and she said, "You did this on purpose. You kept all of this secret just so you could make us look bad in front of everyone." And I almost laughed at the absurdity of that statement, at the idea that I'd built my entire career and planned my entire financial future as some elaborate scheme to embarrass her. Tyler pushed back from the table so abruptly his chair tipped over backward and clattered against the floor, and he said, "This is bullshit. I don't have to listen to this." And he stormed toward the front door. And I heard it slam hard enough to rattle the windows, and I thought how typical it was that he could just leave when things got uncomfortable, while I'd had to sit through years of discomfort at tables just like this one. Dad sat completely still, staring at his plate like it held answers to questions he didn't want to ask. And I remembered suddenly how he used to be when I was very young, before Lauren's achievements started overshadowing everything. How he used to call me his little scholar when I brought home perfect report cards. And I wondered when exactly he'd stopped seeing me and started just going along with Mom's hierarchy of affection. But then Aunt Carol, the same woman who'd called me self-centered an hour earlier, spoke into the tension, and she said, "Emma, I owe you an apology. I didn't know any of this. Your mother never told us how differently she treated you kids, and I'm sorry I judged you without knowing the facts." And her voice was sincere enough that I felt some of the armor around my heart crack just slightly. I saw a few other relatives nodding. Uncle Tom looked uncomfortable and wouldn't meet my eyes, which I took as a form of acknowledgement. Cousin Jenny was staring at Mom with an expression I couldn't quite read, but it wasn't supportive, and I realized that the room had divided itself into factions. Those who were beginning to see the truth, and those who were doubling down on the old narrative because admitting they were wrong was too costly. Mom said through her tears, "I did the best I could. I gave all my children what they needed when they needed it," still justifying, still unable to see that equal love shouldn't come with such wildly unequal price tags. And I looked at her and felt something release inside me, the last thread of hope that she would understand, that any of them would truly understand, and I realized with perfect clarity that I didn't need them to understand anymore. I didn't need their approval or their recognition or their validation. I just needed them to leave me alone. I stood up from the table, and I looked around at all of them one more time, these people who shared my blood but had never really seen me, and I said in a voice that was calm and clear and final, "I want to be very explicit about what happens from this point forward. Because I'm done with ambiguity, and I'm done with assumptions, and I'm done with being whoever you need me to be in the moment." I took a breath and continued. "I am not paying for Tyler's car, not now and not ever, and more broadly, I am not contributing to any future family emergencies or requests or demands, because I've realized that in this family emergency is just code for another opportunity for me to give while everyone else takes." Mom started to speak, but I held up my hand and said, "I'm not finished. I've listened to all of you for years, and now you're going to listen to me." I saw James stand up beside me, a silent show of support, and I felt strengthened by his presence. "I am willing to have a relationship with anyone in this family who wants a genuine relationship with me," I said. And by genuine, I mean based on mutual respect and equal consideration, where my life matters as much as Lauren's life, where my struggles are acknowledged the same way Tyler's struggles are acknowledged, where I'm invited to participate not because you need something from me, but because you actually want me there. I looked at Mom and said, "That means no more calls asking for money, no more guilt trips about family obligation, no more comparisons where I come up short, no more playing favorites, and then getting upset when the unfavorite finally objects." I looked at Lauren and said, "That means you don't get to call me selfish for having boundaries, when you've never had to have boundaries, because everything was always given to you freely." I didn't bother addressing Tyler since he'd already left, but I said to the room at large, "And for anyone who can't accept these terms, anyone who thinks I'm being unreasonable or selfish or ungrateful, I want you to know right now that I'm okay with not having a relationship with you. I have finally reached the point where my peace matters more than your approval." I felt James's hand on my back and I said, "James and I are leaving now. We're going home to our apartment where we'll pack up the rest of our belongings because we're moving into our new house in 2 weeks, and we're going to build the life we want with the resources we've earned, and we're going to do it with or without this family's support because we've been doing it without your support all along, and we've done just fine." I picked up my purse and I walked toward the front door, and I heard Mom say, "Emma, please, don't leave like this." But I kept walking because I'd stayed through enough uncomfortable moments for their benefit, and I was done prioritizing their comfort over my own dignity. 3 months later, I stood in the kitchen of our new house, the 4-bedroom colonial with the pool that we'd closed on 6 weeks earlier, and I was making coffee in the morning sunlight that streamed through windows that were actually ours. In a space that we'd created for ourselves without anyone's help or approval, and I felt something I'd never quite felt before, a sense of peace that came from finally living in alignment with my own values, rather than contorting myself to fit someone else's expectations. James was upstairs in what would eventually be a nursery, painting the walls a soft yellow that worked for either a boy or a girl, because we'd started our first round of IVF 2 weeks earlier, and we were in that strange suspended time of hoping without knowing, of building a future we desperately wanted but couldn't guarantee. The house had cost us $650,000, and every penny of it felt worth it. Every room was a space where we could breathe freely, where we could be ourselves without judgment or comparison, or the constant calculus of whether we were measuring up to impossible standards. In the 3 months since that dinner at Mom's house, my phone had been much quieter than it had been in years. No more daily calls demanding my attention or my money or my emotional labor. No more text messages guilt-tripping me into compliance, and the silence had been strange at first, almost unsettling after decades of conditioning that my worth was tied to my availability, but I'd grown to cherish it. Dad had called 2 weeks after the dinner, his voice awkward and halting, and he'd said, "Emma, I've been thinking about what you said, and I owe you an apology. I stood by and let your mother play favorites, and I told myself it wasn't my place to interfere. But that was just cowardice, and I'm sorry." And we talked for an hour, really talked in a way we hadn't since I was a child, and while I wasn't ready to pretend everything was fine, I was willing to work on rebuilding something real with him. Aunt Carol had come by the new house last week with a housewarming gift, a beautiful set of kitchen towels and a card that said she was proud of me. And we'd sat on my new back patio and had the kind of genuine conversation I'd always wanted with my extended family, where she asked about my work and actually listened to the answers, where she told me about her own struggles with family dynamics, where I felt seen as a full person rather than a supporting character in someone else's story. Mom had sent an email 5 weeks after the dinner, not a phone call, and certainly not a face-to-face conversation, and the email had been careful and somewhat formal, and she'd written that she'd been reflecting on your concerns, and she could see how things might have seemed unequal, and she acknowledged that perhaps she could have been more fair in how she distributed family resources, and it wasn't the apology I'd fantasized about. It wasn't the full recognition of harm and the commitment to change, but it was something. It was at least an admission that my reality had validity. And I'd written back a brief response thanking her for reaching out and saying I needed more time. Lauren hadn't contacted me at all, and I'd seen from social media that she'd posted several pointed quotes about toxic people who turn family events into drama and cutting negative people out of your life, and I'd smiled sadly at the irony that she saw herself as the victim in this situation, but I'd also felt surprisingly okay with her silence, because a relationship based on my diminishment wasn't a relationship worth preserving. Tyler had sent me a text 3 weeks ago asking if I could loan him $1,500 for first and last month's rent on a new apartment, and I'd looked at that message for a long moment, felt the old familiar pull of obligation and guilt. and then I deleted it without responding. And I'd felt powerful rather than guilty, because I'd meant what I said about boundaries, and I was learning that boundaries only work if you actually enforce them. I heard James coming down the stairs, and he wrapped his arms around me from behind and kissed my neck and said, "The nursery is looking good. Want to come see?" And I turned in his arms and looked at his face, this man who'd stood by me and supported me and helped me see my own worth when I couldn't see it myself. And I thought about how I might lose some relationships with my biological family, but I'd gained something infinitely more valuable. I'd gained myself. I'd gained my voice. I'd gained the ability to say no, and mean it, and survive the consequences. I realized standing there in my kitchen that you really do teach people how to treat you, that every time I'd accepted less than I deserved, I'd been sending the message that less was all I was worth, and I was finally teaching a different lesson, one that said I mattered as much as anyone else, that my dreams were as valid as Lauren's dreams, that my struggles deserved as much consideration as Tyler's struggles, that my life had value not because my family recognized it, but because I recognized it. My worth wasn't determined by their approval or their recognition or their love. My worth was inherent and unchanging and mine. And after 28 years of looking for validation in faces that would never offer it freely, I'd finally found it in the only place it could ever really exist, inside myself. And that was enough, more than enough. It was everything.